The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Chris Hutson, and he is the Director of Lifecycle and Manufacturing Solutions at MaintainX. And we're going to dive into what MaintainX does, certainly, but we're also going to dive into the conversation around maintenance within the warehouse, right? We see a lot of equipment, a lot of automation, a lot of new technologies that are coming into this space. A lot of them are mechanical in some type of nature, and they need to be maintained, obviously. So we're going to dive into that. Chris is going to tell us a little bit about kind of current state of maintenance within the warehouse, how that's continuing to evolve along with technology, and how to put together a good maintenance program in your warehouse. So Chris, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Good morning. How are you, Kevin?
Doing well. Happy to get you on here. You know, we certainly talk a lot about automation and robotics and equipment because it's part of the warehousing industry on the podcast, but we haven't had too many conversations around maintaining that equipment and making sure to do that. So I'm definitely excited to have this conversation today. So why don't you give us kind of a brief overview of MaintainX for those that are not familiar?
Yeah, really good question. So as the word implies, MaintainX is a transformative maintenance management system. Some call it a CMMS, computerized maintenance management system. That's kind of a legacy term. I think most currently today is enterprise asset management, or EAM. And so MaintainX basically provides the mobile worker with a mobile first platform that is built for being on the production floor and in the warehouse, executing work, which is typically around assets, work orders, parts, spare parts around those assets, and ultimately integrating into the entire ecosystem to really try to accelerate some of the growth around digital transformation. So it's a cloud-based platform, which has a very effective open API for connecting to other systems.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think definitely something that's necessary, right, to be able to get the most out of your assets and, you know, prolong the life in a sense as well. So I guess tell us a little bit about, you know, I mentioned we haven't really talked much about maintenance on the podcast, which maybe we should have done sooner. We have 500 some episodes, right? We should have got some maintenance in there somewhere, but better late than never, I'll say. So tell us, I mean, right now, because certainly there's been a lot of change in the warehousing industry, specifically from an equipment and types of equipment that are now entering into the warehouse arena. Tell us, I guess, from your view, I mean, what is really the current state of maintenance in the warehouse?
Really good question. And I think when you look at just the evolution of technology and warehouse, and it was interesting, I was listening to one of your other podcasts where a good data point is that, you know, over 80% of warehouse and distribution operations are still somewhat manual, right? Yeah. But I think everyone has an initiative to automate, and not automate to replace, but to augment labor. You know, I learned early on as a summer intern, and we can come back to what it means to try to augment maybe some of the 3D jobs, the dirty, dull, and dangerous, right, is where looking at selective automation. So I think, you know, the state of maintenance in the warehouse is around optimizing the performance of those assets and trying to provide, you know, mobile visibility of just all the connected assets in a system. And that could be a receiving system, a shipping system, a pick system. So I think it's trying to understand and provide what I say ability to the production and warehouse worker. When you say any good EAM should provide ability, it should provide visibility So visual management of how the system is performing that can, even enable rapid problem solving. I think it should provide reliability and not just calendar-based preventive maintenance, but, we can probably talk a little more about condition-based maintenance, predictive, and even prescriptive-based reliability methods. And then I think finally it should provide maintainability. So those three abilities to be able to maintain and optimize performance of your distribution system.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too. You talked about, not only doing like that preventative maintenance, but having that reliability too, I think is such a key aspect, especially as we, shift more things over to automation. And while, overall market penetration is somewhat low, right? As you pointed out, only about 20% or so. And, we want those solutions that we put in place to, augment some of the labor challenges and things of that nature to be reliable, right? We don't want them to break down. We don't want to have them maybe not operating at the optimal level and things of that nature. So certainly a key aspect there. So I'm curious around that. I mean, as we get more automation in place and, there obviously becomes more mechanical components, right, that are in the warehouse. So, as these newer technologies, whether it's robotics, automation, even higher tech, forklifts that are still manually operated, how do we see kind of the maintenance tasks in themselves evolve from where, maybe 10, 15 years, maybe the only equipment you had was maybe a little bit of conveyor and, some forklifts to maintain, right? And now you're bringing in a lot more stuff. So how has that kind of evolved those maintenance actions and activities that need to take place?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when you think about just the lifeblood of a distribution system, it's the ability to ship product. And ultimately, you can't do that unless everything is running reliably. If you think about just some of the new techniques in the industry, everybody's concerned about SKU proliferation, the varied sizes and an average DC that maybe has over 50,000 SKUs they have to maintain. So there's all this software, warehouse management systems, warehouse execution systems, ERP systems, SCADA systems. And so, one of the things within maintenance is the ability of a good enterprise asset management to be connected to all of that data. And, the other thing that is just challenging the industry is the rate of automation. I can remember when a DC maybe was just a couple, miles of conveyor and a few sorters that were critical equipment, and then, now you have cross-docking, you have eaches. And so the ability to stay in tune, even just from fixed place robotics that were maybe even cross-docking, palletizing, depalletizing, now you have all the autonomous mobile robotics, right? So you have these mobile and grid-based high-density systems, and it's, the ability to pinpoint the critical maintenance requirements to ensure overall equipment effectiveness of all that automation.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, it is interesting to see that, right? Because then it certainly, brings on a new set of knowledge in a sense, right? That your maintenance team or facilities team, whoever needs to have some understanding of to be able to help with that, or, do you outsource that to another company, or how do you handle that, right? And it may be drastically different from what you've been doing in the past. I mean, I know from personal experience, I was in a situation where we had a old operation that was still picking on paper in this old facility. And then, we tried to make this huge leap by bringing in like a ASRS system and everything. And there was just one maintenance guy that had been with the company for a very long time, and, trying to get, and, he knew what he was doing. He was handy, like, around the facility. But then when it came to, trying to have him understand and learn, how to deal with PLCs and all these different things with this automation. It was not something that he had background in or understood. And we quickly realized this was not something we really necessarily planned for or thought about, but we need more resource here to be able to support what we're doing here. So, and I think, that probably happens maybe sometimes more than it should, in a sense, to, as you start to make these leaps and these steps forward, you start to understand all the different other aspects that need to go on there to be able to support the output that ultimately you want. So I guess let's dive into a little bit, because you mentioned earlier the CMMS versus the EAM, or EAM,
enterprise
right?
asset.
Yeah. Sure. Let's talk about, what do those systems kind of encompass for people that maybe are not familiar, and how do those systems kind of help to enable some of this knowledge and making sure that some of these activities that should be happening are happening? And as you're adding more equipment and assets, I mean, how does that help to, make sure that you're staying on the right path in terms of maintenance?
Yeah, no, good question. I think if you break it down for that maintenance tech who has seen maybe an influx of automation, right? One of the first things that an enterprise asset management system will help you digitize those assets so that you have all the critical maintenance manuals, technical information, vendor data, recommended spare parts, all the key maintenance activities that have to be OEM recommends performed on that equipment, based on your duty cycle and environment. So it's the ability to ingest all of that digital information and to have it in the palm of your hand, either in a tablet or a mobile device. So if you think about an easy button, which we can provide to automatically digitize all of that and now plan for in your maintenance activities, then it's more around, if you think about that person who maybe has some new automation and doesn't have the tribal knowledge of that equipment and its personality. So now it's the ability to have these 1-point lessons or picture stories on that mobile device that guide you and navigate you through simple things like inspections and calibrations, but then even more advanced, that same system can guide you through more advanced troubleshooting. So, outside of machine learning and all of the prescriptive maintenance that's going on in the space, but a basic tool like to troubleshoot an event, you're called to triage a situation where maybe equipment's down or needs adjustment. And so having what we call conditional based or logic based maintenance activities are kind of the if then else, if this happens, check this. So it's very targeted around, knowledge articles on, instead of a 400-page manual that somebody might have to go through to find a troubleshooting matrix, it's going to guide you through that matrix that if you see this and you check that, now do this. And so the industry is involved, just like the automation within a distribution center, to where we can be much more sophisticated around not only how we execute maintenance, but how we plan for maintenance.
Interesting. And I love the analogy there for make it the easy button, definitely. Right. And, being able to, and I think that's key too, where you mentioned, it's not just, giving you essentially a digital version of the 400-page manual, like you mentioned, right? It's actually giving you some further insight or, more easily digestible, I guess, in a sense, to be able to solve the issue you're facing, right? Or to be able to do those maintenance steps that you need to do. So tell us a little bit too about kind of the intersection there between the system and then you have, industry 4.0 devices, like this idea of connectivity and different sensors that can feed into each other and kind of talk to each other to understand where there's potential issues. Where does, that system and that kind of connectivity kind of intersect?
And that's important. Everybody in the DC now, it's all about velocity, right? I can remember when the industry used to only have a couple of peak seasons a year.
Yeah.
And now through better warehouse management and execution systems and just so much more e-commerce activity, there's very little off-peak times for most of these systems. So I think, like yourself, I go back to just my experience in industry, and ultimately, one of the things that I learned early on, and I spent, like yourself, I spent 3 decades in industry.
Okay.
And so prior to coming to MaintainX, to the software space for enterprise asset management, I actually used the product as a director of manufacturing for a company that had 8 plants globally. And it was important because basic tools like the ability to go off and run in offline mode. So not everybody all has effective Wi-Fi connections in all areas of a DC, but to have people be just like your systems, optimally performing their task. And, I learned early on that I would spend a lot of time watching technicians in a manufacturing plant spend a lot of non-value added time. So when you look at the value stream mapping, you want your technicians and your operators to spend their time more value added based. And so I think bringing the work mobily to those people so that they're not walking around searching for parts, searching for tools, searching for information is a key part. And then to your point, when you can connect those systems to the digital assets and to your ERP, so that now, I know you had a segment on QR codes where I can, at the asset, I can scan a QR code and it can tell me, the lifeblood of that system. I can pull up all the work orders, done in the last month or by a type of fault. So it's a knowledge base in my hand. And then I can scan parts to charge them to a work order to execute work so that the parts and materials, the total cost of ownership around that asset is accurately tracked.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it makes it so much more streamlined in that sense, right? I mean, to be able to track based on something as, like you said, simple as scanning a QR code for this asset. And now you have the history of everything that's going on there. And then certainly, at a higher level too, it kind of helps you to understand and see that data, to see that, we've spent a lot of time fixing this one particular piece of equipment, and is it really worth it to continue to fix, or maybe we need to look at replacement or something like that, or even where is like our maintenance spend going, right? Our facilities spend, and you start to understand those things when you're able to create kind of that ecosystem and that visibility to see everything that's really going on there. And I think, being able to connect it and tie it all together into a system like that, I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. So I guess tell us a little bit about, we talked about the systems in general here and kind of this connectivity, but tell us, like, I guess specifically MaintainX, how does MaintainX come into the picture, and, what makes you different from maybe other providers that are out there?
Yeah, again, I think the built in a cloud mobile first platform. So we're not a web-based tool with a wrapper on it. So the difference there is the real-time insight that's provided with a mobile solution. I think, a differentiator ultimately is ease of use. So you want user adoption. The change management piece of automation, particularly in the software world, can be daunting, right? So one of the things I searched for and looking for that EAM software was the best user interface, and technicians that I would work with had 25 years in industry, more clipboard paper environment, and they would be intimidated when you said software, and they're used more to some of the legacy maintenance management systems that were very computer based, and you almost had to be a reliability engineer to really optimize and get the most out of that system. So I would ask them, hey, do you have a mobile phone? Well, of course, the answer is yes. And do you do mobile banking, or do you have a favorite mobile app like that? And do you text family and friends? And so the answer was within hours, someone like that who's intimidated by software would be using the tool and norming very quickly in day one, to the point where they didn't want to relinquish it, right? They could take a picture and annotate. So one of the differentiators is the user interface, how quickly it can come online, because now you're collecting data. It's hard to do rapid problem solving when you don't trust the integrity of your data.
Yeah.
So the other thing is the messaging. We have a chat, in-app chat system. So not only can it be used within like a Teams channel within our app, where you can take pictures and video and annotate, but it can also be shared with vendors and OEMs, which is pretty and powerful, because now you think about the ability to pull an OEM directly into the point of work and see like the history of a work order, like you would an incident event. And the third thing would be, again, we've talked about it, the ability as a cloud-based software to quickly integrate. I know, you can relate to the ERP systems within warehouse and distribution and how critical they are to, upstream order management and just, item masters and SKU management. So to be able to integrate directly to those systems real time is a really powerful differentiating tool.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that you touched on the user experience, and it's something we talk a lot about on the podcast, just because I think it's something as, especially like you said, the adoption of software may be a little scary or daunting in a sense for people that have been in the industry for a long time and have done things, this way for however many years, right? Why am I going to change my process? It's going to make me go slower. And, this is the way I've always done it, type of mindset. But also then for that newer generation coming in too, as well, that, if you told them, oh, well, we do it with, clipboard and paper, they would say, oh, what? Like, I don't even know how to write on paper anymore, basically, right? Because they've grown up like with such a digital environment. So, I think that is such a key to having a good software product nowadays, especially in the warehouse side of things, because you need to do things, rather efficiently and quickly. And, if you run into a software where, there's a challenge or it's confusing to use, it doesn't make sense, then it becomes a little discouraging, and you try to figure out workarounds, or how am I going to work outside the software, because, the software stinks basically, because it can't do what I need to do and accomplish. So I think, that's such a key focus. And I love that it's, able to be mobile too as well. I think that really helps, because, if you look at a maintenance person or a facilities person that would ideally be using a system like this, typically they're not just in one spot all day, right? I mean, they're going to where the asset is, they're going to where the equipment is. So, you want to have that by them so they can accomplish what they need to accomplish. So very interesting there. And,
I think,
sure.
The data that's out there, just piggybacking on that, Kevin, is that, 80% of the workforce is mobile, and they require, real-time access in order to ingest data to make, to understand and identify problems, and then more importantly, to visualize those and actually execute that. So the ability to connect all of those assets and system as you can imagine, is super imperative to empower those mobile workers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of talked about the system side of things, right? And the system that's kind of enabling these activities to happen, and some of the activities that now need to happen in the evolution of that. Let's talk a little bit about, from a facilities maintenance or management program, whatever you want to call it. I mean, obviously there's goals that, the maintenance team needs to accomplish, right? But tell us about kind of like getting a robust program in place, and, a defined program, I think maybe is the right way to put it, is, how does that make an overall impact on the operation itself, right? Not just like, okay, everything's working, but what does that really mean to really invest and put the time into making sure that you have a great program to be able to support the rest of the operation?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
Yeah, and when you think about an entire facility, and I've been in many of these distribution centers, worked for a company that used to be one of the industry leading suppliers of high-speed e-fulfillment systems for just about all the big logos you could think of. And, there's all this automation that's generating and supplying all the output in those centers. But, many of them are over 1 million square feet. So you have all rooftop units, compressed air systems. And so one of the things I did as a director of manufacturing when I wanted to integrate all of these critical assets was to work with the team and let's agree on sort of the Pareto of what are the top 20% of our most critical assets. Everybody in a DC is going to say our shipping sorter is certainly one of those critical assets, right? And but there are things like compressed air systems, switchgear, rooftop units. All of those can be critical to your facility and infrastructure. So you want to, I think, make sure that you have a plan to ensure and optimize reliability of those critical assets. You want to have, resource planning tools, because last I checked, there's still sort of this resource shortage in industry. Yeah. And even with all the automation, you want to ensure that you're really scheduling your resources around those critical assets, and that you have a tool that can sort of drag and drop and easily adjust, because the system is, you have to be agile, right? Things are going to change daily. So I think now that you have identified those critical assets, you've built and digitized a maintenance plan, and hopefully that does entail, like you were alluding to, some connectivity to those assets, whether it's PLC, whether it's IoT sensors, to be able to really do condition-based monitoring and more predictive and prescriptive, with machine learning and AI. There are lots of tools out there to really help the maintenance teams and the operation teams. When you think about the amount of planned downtime that occurs from a traditional calendar-based preventive maintenance to really sort of get into the more advanced maintenance pyramid around prescriptive and predictive maintenance technology. So I think those things can really help optimize the performance of the system around your critical assets, make sure your resources are scheduled effectively, and give you visibility around and ultimately reduce total cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's, you mentioned some of the systems there and different assets or equipment that maybe are not necessarily thought about, right, from the day-to-day perspective, right? But if they go down, or there's a definite impact on the operation overall, from productivity standpoint, efficiency standpoint, all those different things. And I think probably maybe the scariest word sometimes is downtime, right? In a sense, for an operation, especially a high volume operation, because being down for a couple minutes could mean, a couple hundred orders maybe potentially are delayed, right? And that throws off, that could throw you off for a day. It could throw you off for a little more, depending on how you're set up. But, I think it's very critical to be able to invest in that and put that program together. So, I guess kind of maybe tying back to the beginning of our conversation here, we talked about how obviously maintenance and looking at these things has evolved a little bit in terms of activities and maybe some of the knowledge you need to have to around some of these robotics or automation that's coming into play. So if people are put in this maintenance program, right, that we just talked about and kind of defined and have an understanding of everything, how do they make sure that And maybe are you able to leverage the system to be able to do this? I mean, how do you make sure your maintenance program is kind of keeping up to date with these evolutions in technologies and equipment overall? How do you make sure that, that's continuing to evolve as your operation evolves?
That's a really good question, Kevin. I think it's continuing to baseline, right? Doing things like you're doing for the space is educating yourself around the tools that are available. I think it's partnering with software companies, for example, and vendors that understand the industry, have benchmarked, best practices. One of the things that you should look for, I think, in any enterprise asset maintenance solution is the ability to do lean standard work, right? So we have customers that have 20 to 30 distribution centers.
Yeah.
And guess what? A lot of the automation within those centers is similar. And so to be able to have a system that shares data and can benchmark best practices within each of those distribution centers and capitalize on standardizing that lean tool that allows them to be the competitive differentiator. So I think it's really having a system that can share data across multiple DCs, look at where some of the best practices are in terms of not only how you're optimizing output of the system, but how you're best utilizing resources, how the cost factor is. And then, the other thing that is top of mind for everyone is safety and compliance within a DC.
Right.
Make sure you have a tool that's supporting your efforts around, environmental and safety compliance.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's such a great point too. You have like multiple DCs in your network, and there's certainly similarities there, and and especially too, I think when it comes to some of this automation or technologies, a lot of companies I see that they're starting out in like one or two DCs, testing it, right, and then expanding, right. So if you can have that kind of knowledge base and that base on, like you said, at the starting point, and then you can expand that throughout, right, then it just becomes easier the more implementations you do and the more you roll out the same types of things across your entire network. So very interesting stuff with you here, Chris, and really interesting to dive into this maintenance side of the warehouse, which I think is probably an overdue conversation, I'll say, for the podcast. So I'm happy we could connect and talk about this from your perspective and from MaintainX's perspective. So if people want to learn more about maintenance in the warehouse, or they want to learn more about MaintainX specifically, what's the best way to do that?
MaintainX.com. Certainly you'll see there's an entire community channel. There's lots of educational tools, case studies, but one of the things that we like to do through the discovery process is really fully understand where people are in the journey. Typically that can involve starting small, build a win within that initiative to secure and standardize, and then be able to make that scalable across your entire enterprise.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it and get a little better at maintenance in their operation. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.